Time. Thank you, Rick. Rick, why don't you actually stay up here?
Okay.
I want to invite the first panel to come up. So we're going to be talking about COVID impact and recovery. And I'll just tell you very quickly about the first panel while folks come up. Yeah, Sonya, do you want to come up? Yeah. So it's going to kick off with Rick sort of talking about what is the economic costs of the pandemic and the costs, especially if there is not academic recovery. And then Katharine Strunk, who works closely with policymakers in Michigan using Michigan data, is going to be talking about what she is learning about academic recovery. And oh, thank you. I have to use this because it is being recorded. Is that right? Yeah. I sound a little less like Sean Connery on the mic, but sorry. So Katharine's going to be talking about what she's learning from Michigan. And then Tim Sass, who works with a consortium of school districts in Georgia, is going to be talking about what he's been learning in Georgia. And Elise Dizon-Ross, who is the newest CALDER researcher, is going to be talking about what we're learning from a consortium of school districts that we are working with on academic recovery initiatives. And then Sonya Stevens, who is the Chief Performance Officer from Guilford County Public Schools and was nice enough to come up and serve as a reactor, is going to be reacting to what she hears. And Guilford is actually one of the school systems that we are working with. So thank you very much, Sonya, for doing this. So Rick, you've got the floor.
Now for a different message. How do I do this?
So the forward error, it should be. Yeah.
Okay. So what I want to talk about now is some estimates of the economic cost of the pandemic. I have been just frustrated and aghast that this has not gotten much attention. If you saw, David Leonhardt had a column in this morning's New York Times about interviewing the economic outcomes of the Biden administration. And you could go through that whole discussion with his former head of the economic group in the White House. You could go through the whole discussion and there was not a sentence about education. Not a sentence. And what I'm going to tell you very simply is that the economic cost of learning losses from the pandemic are orders of magnitude larger than the economic cost of the recession that was related to the pandemic. They're orders of magnitude larger than the 2008 Great Recession, and yet they have gotten no attention. So that's what I'm going to quickly give you, and then we can talk about it. I think the answer is that we will also talk about possible ways to deal with this in the next session. So the basic argument here is one that I think everybody in this room agrees to, and that is that skills and income go together. And in particular, people who know more earn more. Now, that statement is particularly important for the United States, because if you look at the relationship between skills of people as measured by our Common Achievement Test and incomes across at least the developed countries of the world, the US actually tends to reward skills more than almost every other country in the world. The US, and what we'll get into quickly, is a standard deviation in achievement in the US is worth, on average, 26% higher income than an average person, okay, over their lifetime. And 26%, I think, is a fairly noticeable number. But play it backwards. And it says, if you have one standard deviation less skills than the average, you earn 26% less than the average person. So while the US rewards skills more than almost every other country in the world, it penalizes the lack of skills more than every other country in the world. And that's the story behind learning losses, is that this cohort of students is going to be punished throughout their lifetime, at least unless the schools get better. So that's part of it. The other part of it is that states and nations grow faster if they have a more skilled population. And so if you look around the world, you see that countries that have higher skilled people are growing faster. And as you know, economic growth is what makes us better off than our parents and makes our kids better off than us, is that it increases the well-being of society. So what I'm going to try to do is put those together. One of the arguments behind this is that I'm trying to translate the kinds of statements made by NCES and the national assessment that says, well, math achievement of 8th graders went down by 8 points. There's 8 points. It allows people, there were a couple stories in local newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times that basically said, it's only 8 points. It's not as bad as we thought it was. And so nobody understands what 8 points means, and seldom do they understand what a standard deviation means. It turns out that 8 points is roughly 22 standard deviations. And so what I want to do is translate that into things that people might understand better, at least partially. One of the things that we'll do is put on values for individuals. So in the aggregate, what I'm doing is taking the NAEP data for states that was released just in December that related to spring testing in 2022. And I'm comparing the scores in March of 2022 to the 2019 scores and sort of say, now this is a very crude measure and it can be off in various ways, but it basically says how much worse are kids doing after the pandemic than comparable kids before the pandemic were doing. When you do that, you come out with the answer that combining it with what I said about the returns to schooling in the US, when you put those together, you find that the average person in the COVID cohort is going to have 5.6% lower lifetime earnings than people who weren't in that cohort on average. The other half of that is that we know from all kinds of sources that disadvantaged kids suffered a lot more than the average. And so what this is going to say is that the future income, achievement gaps and income gaps are going to grow because of the pandemic. Secondly, if I put that on in terms of the nation and what I said about economic growth, here's where I don't improve on 8 points. The loss is $28 trillion in present value terms. This is taking and projecting out different growth rates into the future, discounting them back to the present at 3%. So that these are in current dollars. Nobody knows what $28 trillion is, right? I mean, it's as opaque as 8 points. But we have currently a $25 trillion economy. That's what the GDP for the US is. So it's something in excess of 1 year's GDP. You can translate that into the lengthy discussions about the Biden proposals for increasing the federal budget, which were a portion of that. You can translate that into the best estimates or reasonable estimates. I don't know if they're the best. Reasonable estimates of the business cycle costs of the pandemic are $2 trillion. That's the difference between expected GDP and actual GDP. If I looked at the 2008 recession, the cost of the 2008 recession was $5 trillion. And you can compare that directly to $28 trillion. So that what all of the media attention and other attention has been about the unemployment, the closing of some stores and so forth. My kids who owned retail stores ended up being hit by COVID and so forth. All the attention has been about that, when in fact, the real costs just dwarf all of those costs and all of that discussion. These losses, I calculate, will be permanent unless the schools get better. So these losses assume that the schools get back to the level they were at in January of 2020, which I don't think we're there yet. We're still struggling in a number of places to get to the January 2020 level. And everybody's looking at that as the goal now. But if you remember, when at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion that said, well, we have to use this opportunity to make our schools better. And that discussion has just evaporated. The whole discussion is about, can we get the air conditioning up to standards as opposed to doing something about the schools. So let me just give you the newer part of this analysis, and that has to do with the recent NAEP data. It gives you state by state estimates of the difference, and I'll try to put this into individual states. What we see if we look at the NAEP scores by the same sort of crude estimate of learning losses by taking the difference in scores between 2019 and 2022, we see there's huge differences across states in the amount of learning losses. They're quite dramatic. And that leads to dramatic differences in the impact on the average kid in each state, lifetime earnings, and on state income growth. So here's the graph. We've got enough screens here, but I've made the font small enough that nobody can read it. Okay, so that's been my goal here, is to have this up here, but you can't read it. What it says is that on the left-hand side, Utah had much smaller learning losses than every other state. And so there are kids in Utah in the COVID cohort can expect to have 2% lower lifetime earnings for some time. If we go to the other extreme and we get to Delaware and Oklahoma, kids in Delaware and Oklahoma can expect to have, on average, 9% lower lifetime earnings, according to the data we have on the values of earnings. Okay, so I'm going to walk over and show everybody what they're looking for. What you see here is Virginia is right in the middle. And what you see here is Maryland, which is third from the bottom. So I take it I've handled most of the audience here with, but
DC.
Washington is also
Right, you were doing that, yeah.
District of Columbia is a little bit below the national average in terms of losses. The largest losses are a bit larger Any other state? No. Um, these pictures are available, but actually on my website, and I'll give you a hint at the end how you can get it, and you can look in detail at this. But what this says is this is the average again. This is not what happens to the more disadvantaged kids who have undoubtedly suffered larger learning losses. Okay, so that translates directly into a similar picture about what happens to states' economic growth, because we have, similar to the national data, we have information on the economic growth rates and how they're affected by the skills of the population. This lowers the skills of the local population. Probably doesn't apply to DC, because DC just takes in everybody from outside and then gets its money from everybody else. But this says that, and the picture is the same, by the way. I've reversed the axis, so you have to look a little bit harder. But the Delaware and Oklahoma lose a large percentage. It's the same as the learning losses, and Utah does better. The one thing that's a little bit different from that is that if I give you the magnitude of losses, that's a slightly different picture. The slightly different picture is that California is the far left column here, that's losing in present value terms $1.3 trillion. And why is that? Well, California is in about the middle of learning losses, but it's the biggest state in terms of GDP. So you end up losing more in dollar terms. And what you see on the left-hand side of this, the biggest dollar losses are just the size of the GDP in each of the different states. So that Virginia and Maryland are right next to each other now. And that reflects the fact that Maryland's economy is larger than Virginia's, and so it sort of equalizes out with the learning losses. So this is the end of my story. I mean, the end of my story is that if we allow this to continue, which we're on course to do, we have harmed this cohort permanently. Many of you have children in this cohort. The answer is, by the way, that if you look within the data, you see that there are some kids, like 10%, who actually came out ahead with the pandemic, either because their parents found better ways for them to go to school, or they provided a lot of support at home, or some combination of that. But the majority are going to be hurt. But it's something. The problem with all of this is that it's something like high blood pressure. It's the silent killer. You won't notice it, you know. Parents are coming out in surveys and saying, well, in fact, schools seem to be doing okay because my kid's getting an A. And that's the status that we're at, that we have to deal with, in my opinion. So I will stop there and turn it over to other people. But on the top here is a place where you can get the research. You can get it at Hoover Institution or off my website. You can find it. And it's got those pictures. And it's got a little 2-pager that you can take to your local governor and say, here's what you're going to lose. Thanks.
Should have gone last, Rick, because then you could have talked about my achievement learning losses, and then we would have gone into the cost of those. How do I get to the slides for the next?
If you just press the forward arrow.
Perfect. There you go. Okay. Thanks for having us back in person. We're excited to be here. So I'm going to talk about some work we're doing in Michigan. I am the director of the Education Policy Innovation Collaborative at Michigan State, and we are the state's strategic research partner, which meant that during the pandemic, suddenly there was an even bigger need than there had been before to understand what was happening with education in the state. So we have been working with them for the last 3 years to understand how learning is affected and how achievement is affected in Michigan. This is a big team, and you'll sort of see why from all the data that we're using. Okay, so because I was the first person talking about the achievement aspect on today, I thought I would give you guys the sites that you all probably already know about what we already know, which is that, and as Rick said, achievement has been greatly impacted by the pandemic, and that's become clear in a lot of states and a lot of national data sets from people actually in this room. We also know that it's been worse for some kids than others, in particular students from low-income schools and districts, or from students of color, students who may have been learning remotely for more of the time in 2021. So, you know, there's a growing literature about this, and we're adding to that. We're asking 3 main questions in this paper that we're presenting today, which is, you know, how did the pandemic affect, and I'm using affect, we can't really get at a great causal estimate here. So this is what we think is happening with student achievement in Michigan. How did these trends differ during the pandemic? So for students of color, for students who are learning remotely, for low-income students, we want to not only look at the overall effect of the pandemic, but also what happened during the pandemic. So not just sort of the summative outcomes at the end, but what do we see happening during the actual couple of years of the pandemic? Just to give you an overview of what I'm going to tell you. We do find larger negative growth, negative achievement effects in math than in ELA, which is what we've been seeing across the country. In fact, our estimates are at about 0.2 standard deviations overall, which matches up the name. The drops in math were larger for Latino and Black students than they were for white students, and they were larger for economically disadvantaged students than they were for their wealthier peers. We do see that students in districts that were operating remotely for longer in the 2021 school year experienced, students that were learning in person had far less negative effects than the students who were learning remotely for longer during the pandemic. But these kind of overall numbers mask what happened during the pandemic. So these achievement trends that happened in that first year in 2021, and then in 21-22, and we started to think about rebound. And kind of like what Rick said, things are progressing, but potentially not at a rate fast enough to overcome the learning losses that occurred during the first year of the pandemic. And I think we're all waiting with bated breath to see what happens this year to understand, are schools actually getting better at being able to remediate and help students progress, or is it that they're kind of going back to where they were, and which is not going to be at a rate fast enough to help us overcome the challenges that we experience. I should say at the outset, I do have 2 children who were affected by the pandemic, and they were in Michigan Public School District during the pandemic. And, you know, this is a very personal topic for, I think, a lot of us in this room. Okay, so I'm going to use 2 sets of data to get at this question. So the first one is our summative steps, which is like our summative end of year tests that we have in Michigan. They were obviously offered in 2019, and then they were not offered in 2020. In 2021, they were optional in Michigan. So we had about a 70% participation rate. It was a very skewed sample. So we don't use those either. And so then we have the 22 step achievement tests that we use. We're focusing on the middle school cohort, and we're doing that because we're going to look at a pre-pandemic versus a pandemic cohort of kids, and we want to follow those same kids over time. And since we have students in Michigan are tested from 3rd to 7th grade on the M-STEP, the 8th grade is actually the PSAT, so we don't use that in that sample. So again, we're going to look at a pre-pandemic cohort that took a test in 2016 and then took it again in 2019. So all their testing and learning in this time was done before the pandemic. And then we're comparing them to what happened to kids who are taking the test in 2019 before the pandemic, and then 2022, which is sort of after the most impacted years of the pandemic. So again, these students were in sort of 3rd and 4th grade in that base year, and then they were in 6th and 7th grade in that end year. Here's just a quick look at the sample. So, you know, the main thing is that these demographic characteristics are pretty similar of the kids. You will see that it's a smaller sample size in the pandemic cohort than the pre-pandemic cohort, and that's because Michigan has been a declining enrollment state for over a decade, for 2 decades. And that was accentuated during the pandemic, obviously. So we have a smaller sample size, but demographically similar. And these are just basic descriptives, but you can see the main takeaway, which is going to be that the pandemic cohorts had negative achievement growth during the pandemic, and it was bigger than any negative achievement growth or null sort of achievement growth during the pre-pandemic years. Okay, I'm going to skip over this because I forgot the no math rule. Sorry, but I've already explained what we do. So again, we're just comparing the pandemic cohort to the pre-pandemic cohort, adjusting for all sorts of things. Then we have the benchmark assessment data and sample. This is a slightly different thing. So we're not able to compare pre to a post-pandemic cohort here because districts were not required to offer benchmark assessments prior to the pandemic. But during the pandemic, we were successfully able to have these conversations with the state to say, like, you really want to know what's going on in your schools during this time? And they said, yeah, we do. And so they required that all districts offer a benchmark assessment. They gave them 4 options to choose from. But the ones that the majority of state districts took up was the NWEA. Another subset took up iReady. That's largely different by Detroit with using iReady, but a lot of districts used iReady, but a smaller set. And then we don't look at the other 2 assessments. They're not vertically scaled and it's harder to use them. And also just very few students and districts actually took them. And the sample that did was very highly skewed to white and rural. So we do have about 60% of districts in our analysis. And again, we focus on the same group. We focus on this middle school, 5th to 7th grade here, so that we can try to kind of compare apples to apples with the MSTEP assessment. I will say politics are tricky. So the way that we were able to access the data, and right now I think we are the only ones with access to these data, are we had to aggregate them to the district by subgroup level. So that was because there's worries about, are we going to use this to evaluate teachers or evaluate schools, and nobody wanted to do that. So we have access to the district level data that we've been working with. Here's our sample. So these are, again, middle schoolers. We have about 56% of 5th to 7th graders in our analytic sample. And you can see we have a slightly more advantaged population in the sample than we have overall in Michigan. And that's because we have to follow them for all 4 assessments, right? So we follow them for the fall, spring during the pandemic, and a lot of kids moved around and didn't have those 4 scores. Giving that. This is a very, very descriptive look when this is not at all. Okay, so the first thing I want to show you is just, something that we took comfort in, which is, we want to think about how students were doing pre-pandemic, which we have MSTEP data for, then during the pandemic, where we have benchmark data, and then after the pandemic, the 2022 MSTEP. And so both NWA and iReady have norming samples that they look at, and they say, how does this predict how you're going to do on your end of year summative scores? And we find that they're pretty highly aligned. In fact, it's about a 0.9 correlation between the test scores for MSTEP and what the NWA and iReady are. And what you can see here is, we broke it up into the advanced, proficient, partially proficient, and not proficient levels. And those bottom 2 are the not proficient and partially proficient, the lighter colors. And you can see that, between the 2018-19 MSTEP and the 2021 benchmarks, there was a pretty big increase in the proportion of kids who were scoring below proficient, and a correspondingly small decrease in the proportion of students who were scoring proficient or advanced. About 8.2% more students started scoring below proficient in math, and in about it went for about, I think, 7% percentage more students were scoring below proficient in reading. And that persisted through the pandemic. So we didn't see a huge difference between 2021 and 21-22. So now we're going to look at sort of some of these models. So this is the MSTEP cohort. This is looking at the pre versus the post-pandemic. That 0 line on the top is going to tell you sort of the pre-pandemic cohort. And then the dots are the difference between the pre-pandemic cohort and the pandemic cohort scores. We use a model with student controls, and we also add district fixed effects and another model, almost identical results. This is the student level data, by the way, I should make that clear. And so what you can see is math had a pretty big decrease over this 3-year cohort at about 0.2 standard deviation in Michigan. This is adjusted, obviously. Much smaller, but significant in ELA. This is at about 3/100ths of a standard deviation. So I'm going to just switch to the district fixed effects model so we can show a lot of dots on one graph. So here we are looking at this by race, ethnicity, economic disadvantage. We have math on your left, ELA on your right. And now the 0 line is the pre-pandemic cohort for the reference category. So for white and then for economically advantaged. And what you can see is that pre-pandemic, which is on the far left, the green is the pre-pandemic now, the blue is the blue is the pre-pandemic, the green is the pandemic. You can see, white students before the pandemic were scoring at the 0 line. That's what we have them tagged at. And then you can see during the pandemic, they were like 0.19 standard deviations below that pandemic cohort. But for Black students, they were already scoring, below the white students pre-pandemic, but that gap magnified during the pandemic. The Black students are doing substantially worse in the pandemic cohort than the white students, even relative to the pre-pandemic comparison. Latino students, the same, not quite as huge as the Black difference, but grew quite a lot. Same story for economic disadvantage. This is all in math. So students were already scoring below their wealthier peers prior to the pandemic, but that gap magnified during the pandemic. This is following Rick's exact narrative that some students were hurt a lot more than others during the pandemic. ELA, you see, not nearly the same kind of thing. All students did slightly worse during the pandemic, but the gaps did not grow massively. Okay, so here we're going to look at what happens with modality of instruction during the 2021 school year. So in Michigan, districts were allowed to decide for themselves whether they were going to be in person or remote or hybrid in each month. So we helped the state collect data on what districts were doing in each month. And so we have very good, and then the governor's office got, we really wanted to understand this. So they actually were helping us make sure the data were accurate in each month, which was super helpful. And so we had really nice data to tell us every month if districts were offering in-person instruction, remote or hybrid. We classify this as in-person if you're at least offering students an option to be learning in person full-time. And then we have it by the number of months of the year. So the reference categories that they were in person, they were offering in person for all 9 months of the school year. And then you can see we also have students who are learning in districts that were offering it for 5 to 8 months, for 1 to 4 months, thank you, and for none of the year. What's interesting to us is that, for the math, you see students who were learning remotely for at least part of the year did substantially worse than students who were learning in person for the whole year. That's the reference line, as students who are learning in person. But there's not a huge difference based on how many months you were learning remotely. So there seems to me to be a story that we've been hearing in the media about, well, if you're learning remotely the whole year, it must be terrible. We're thinking there's a little more nuance to that, which is something about disruption. So I had kids anecdotally who were in and out, right? They were remote, then they were hybrid, then they were in person, then they were hybrid. And that was really hard for them. And I can imagine that it's accentuated for kids who had other kinds of disruption in their homes. And the districts were responding to things that were happening around them, right? They were responding to higher COVID rates. They were responding to, fear in the community. And so there was probably magnified disruptions that were going on for the students who were learning remotely at a given time. So we see, if they're learning remotely for part of the year, at least, they, experience about 1/4 of a standard deviation over those 3 years, lower achievement growth than they would have pre-pandemic. ELA, we do not see the same magnitude here, which is, basically what we're seeing in the national narrative as well. We did want to understand if this was worse or, better for certain groups of kids, for, Black, Latino, low-income kids. We don't really see differences. So it doesn't look like students who are low income or in Black and learning remotely were more adversely effective than white or higher income students who are learning remotely. Okay, so now we're going to switch to the benchmark data that we have. So this is, we now see the big picture pre-post pandemic, but we want to understand what happened during the pandemic. So the little dots on the far left are, purple is math, green is reading. Those are, we adjusted the 2019 M-STEP scores for reference. So that's against the Michigan sample, that's normed against the Michigan sample. I should say this is a group that had to have taken the test in 2019 if they're included in there, and as well as the 4 time periods during the pandemic. And so that's a different group, which is lower than the Michigan average. But then we use for the NWA and the iReady, we actually look at the national norm sample and we compare Michigan to that. So this is a little bit confusing. The way you have to interpret these are a flat line would mean that Michigan students are making the expected achievement growth according to the national norm prior to the pandemic. If it goes down, it means that they're actually losing relative to the national norm. And if it goes up, they're gaining relative to the national norm would have predicted. And so to Rick's point from earlier, you'd actually want to see an upward slope happening, because that would mean that they're overcompensating, right? And they're doing better than would have been predicted prior to the pandemic. So what you see in that first year, 2020 to 2021 fall spring, are pretty steep drops. Both math and ELA. Interestingly, reading is actually steeper than math, but you can tell if you're comparing it against 2019 scores, which is, do it with caution. The original drop between 2019 spring and the fall of 2020 was much less for ELA and reading. So that initial sort of first 3 months of the pandemic combined with the prior year, we didn't see as much of a drop in student achievement in reading as we did in math in that initial time period. Michigan students sort of learned more than we would have expected, a lot more than we would have expected over the summer. So usually we would see, summer learning loss, which would have been a flat line here. But here we see that they actually rebounded. Now, we don't actually know why that is because we don't think there were like a ton of, we don't have any data to tell us that there were a ton of summer learning options happening across the state, but we don't have the data to know. So that would be a lovely thing we would have loved to have collected. But they rebounded quite a bit. But then you can see in reading, they went back down in that second pandemic school year. And in math, they kind of went what we would have expected, about average. So now let's look at it by race and ethnicity. So the purple line is white, the green line is black, and the blue line, light blue line is Latino. And what you can see here is it's actually, basically we see steeper drops in that first year for Black students than we do for white or Latino students. And if you look in math, that white line, you actually see they didn't drop that much. But Black students in 2021 had quite a strong decrease relative to national norms in their achievement during that year. And then they did have some rebounding, both Black and Latino students in that second pandemic year, but not nearly enough to compensate. And so the gaps are now slightly bigger than they were. ELA, same thing, gaps are a little bit bigger, but not substantially so. Same story for students who are economically disadvantaged in Michigan. I want to point out this very steep drop here for low-income students in math in that first pandemic school year. So even though they had some summer learning, regaining, and they went up a little bit in that second year, they just are much lower than that green dot would have expected in the prior to the pandemic time. So what we're seeing here is really a story about huge losses in 2021, some catching up over the summer, and then maybe staying a little bit stable. Maybe some kids were growing a little bit, some kids were still decreasing a little bit in 21, 22, but it seems like that learning loss was really driven in that first year of the pandemic. Okay, so here's what we did to look at it by the same groups of, in-person learning. And I took out the confidence intervals here because they're all overlapping. So it doesn't look like on the benchmark assessments, we're seeing, significant differences between students who were learning in person versus students who are learning remotely for at least part of the year. But I do want to point out in math, that first year, students who were learning in person for all 9 months of the school year, that's the dark purple line, they were flat in that first year. So they didn't actually experience a lot of learning loss. They did have that summer rebound, and then they were flat in that second year. As opposed to students in the other three groups that dropped substantially in that first year and then sort of gained a bit, but stayed sort of more or less flat in that second year. So again, this is back to Rick's point, big drops in 2021, and then in 21, 22, they went back to normal to some extent, and we didn't see overcompensation. Here's just with the standard errors, so you can see what a mess they are. Okay, so what are our takeaways and implications here? The first one is, this is not a good story, right? So student learning during the pandemic, really occurred at a slower rate than before the pandemic. And that was really concentrated, it seems, in that first school year. And in the 21, 22 year, there were some gains. There were some learning gains over the summer that seemed to have happened in Michigan, but they weren't really enough to compensate entirely in math in particular. This was particularly bad for Black, Latino, and low-income students. We have sort of some conflicting evidence about what happened if you learned in person versus learned remotely. It sort of seems like you learned remotely from all of the year. You did substantially worse, but in math, but there's some, if you learned in person for all of you did substantially better, but there's not as much variation between how many months you were learning remotely. So we've been talking a lot in Michigan with friends in state government about what to do. The first thing we want people to be, cognizant of is exactly this. I get reports home from my kids like, oh, everyone's caught up, they're fine. And I'm looking at them like, I don't know that that's exactly right. So we kind of want to keep the message going that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a massive impact on kids' learning, and it's especially in math, not gone. And it's worse for certain kinds of kids than others. And we need to be really focusing what we're doing on the kids who are most impacted by the pandemic. And that we need we had a really great budget passed in Michigan with much more funding in the last 2 years, and targeted particularly an equity-based funding formula, which has changed from Michigan, which is really important. We need more of that. Right, we need more money going to these districts that were remote for longer, and remote for the whole year, and that are serving the kids in the most expensive populations. We also are stressing that we need to keep on collecting the data. So people are kind of thinking like, oh, yeah, we're done. And we're thinking, actually we're not. We need to keep on collecting these data so we can keep on understanding which kids still need more resources targeted at them. So I'm going to let it go. I think it's Tim, are you next? And I'm sure you got similar results from Georgia.
But no happy news.
No happy.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here in person with everyone. Today I'm going to talk about a summer school program from a school district in the Atlanta metro area. This is joint work with one of my students, Sarah Berry. We're at Georgia State, where we have a policy lab called MAPLE, the Metro Atlanta Policy Lab for Education. We work with 5 school districts in the Atlanta metro area. Today I'll be talking about work with 3 of those that together have about 250,000 students. So I'll give you a little bit of context in Georgia, much like Michigan and the rest of the US. A little bit on methods, but no Greek symbols. And then what we found and its implications. So here's the picture for math in these 3 metro districts, Fulton of grand jury fame, Clayton and DeKalb. And here you're looking at the national percentile ranks for a fixed group of students. So these are students that were in grades 1 through 5 in 2017-18. And then we follow them along through the end of the 21-22 school year. And we require for the sample that they be students that took all the pandemic era exams. So the changes you see are not changes in the composition of the cohort. And you can see that, like elsewhere, there were significant reductions in national percentile ranks during the pandemic, some recovery, but for example, in the case of Clayton, which is over 90% Black and Hispanic students, and virtually all the schools are community eligibility provision schools, things haven't gotten much better. And here's the same chart for reading. Similar story, losses not as great as math, and some recovery, but still, for the most part, below pre-pandemic levels. So what we're going to focus on here are initiatives to try and accelerate student achievement, get students back on track. And based on national surveys of superintendents, the most popular tool is summer learning programs. About 3/4 of superintendents said they were going to use federal relief funds to have summer learning programs. Less than half were planning to spend money on high-intensity tutoring or have additional learning time. In the Atlanta metro area, it's quite variable in terms of what districts are doing. So if you look at the tutoring front, we have one partner that's basically been business as usual, really hasn't done anything new in terms of tutoring. Another has been using a voluntary online program, and a third has a fairly robust in-person tutoring program. If you take a look at extended learning time, some districts haven't extended the school day at all. At least one district is extended by 30 minutes. But all the districts, not only the ones we'll talk about today, but throughout the Atlanta metro area, have continued to have summer programming. But once again, quite a variety in terms of duration and content. So this work focuses on one Atlanta metro district and their 2021 summer learning program. The program was offered to kids throughout K through 12. We're going to focus on students in 1 through 8 for a couple of reasons. One, because our testing data only goes through grade 9, and also because the selection process and content for the high school kids was different. So, like a lot of education data, the data is a bit messy. There were actually 11 criteria this district used to invite students to summer school. And we only have data on 8 of those criteria. After the initial invitations, not enough kids accepted the invitation, so they opened up the program to everyone. So that muddies the waters further. So in this district, they had a half-day in-person program during summer 2021. There were actually 2 sessions, one in June, one in July. Both sessions were 3 weeks each. Students could attend both sessions for up to 6 weeks of instruction. There was no attendance requirement. District did provide transportation and they did provide meals. So there was some inducement there to send your students to summer school. As I said, we observed 8 of the criteria that were used to invite students to summer school. And overwhelmingly, the most prevalent criteria in which students qualified for an invitation was low test scores on their mid-year formative assessments. And 97% of the invitees we know of were invited because of low test scores. There were a variety of other criteria used, incompletes in specific courses, first graders if there was low attendance, and then some things we don't observe that we know went on, teacher recommendation, students being considered for retention, and so forth. So we can't distinguish between students that were invited for an unknown reason and students that weren't invited at all. So once again, we're focusing on students in grades 1 through 8. And we have 2 groups we're looking at: students that were invited to summer school based on below grade level scores in their formative assessments during the prior winter. Roughly 30,000 students. And then the comparison groups who students that were not invited based on that criteria and did not attend. So there's a relatively small group that were invited for unknown reasons, but together that's a fairly small group, less than 700 students. And if we run the analysis including that group, results don't really change. So because of this hard cutoff of being below grade level, we can use a so-called regression discontinuity approach, using their formative assessment scores from winter to look at kids that were invited versus not. So this is an intent to treat analysis. We'd like to do treatment on the treated, but trying to come up with instruments to deal with the selection issue is problematic. So we're going to focus, at least in this presentation, on the intent to treat, the impact of the invitations. So if we look at the assignment of invitations, indeed, it seems like there was a high level of fidelity that students that were supposed to be invited based on their below grade level scores indeed were invited. So we've normalized the scores here. So the 0 value represents kids right on the threshold of being below grade level and hence supposed to be invited. Indeed, the scores below that threshold, virtually all were invited. But there were non-trivial numbers that either because they met some other criteria, be it incompletes in a course or things we don't observe like teacher recommendation. However, if you look at participation, you can see that for those below the test score threshold, participation was low, and there was also some participation by students that were above that test score invitation threshold. So some parents sent their kids to summer school even if they weren't invited. Here's kind of the standard RD graph. And you can see that there's virtually no impact of being invited to summer school. In fact, if anything, it's the reverse of what you might expect, because remember, it's the kids on the left-hand side of the group that are getting invited because they have low test scores. If the invitation led to improvements in student achievement, we'd expect that left-hand side of the graph would be above the right-hand side. So that's the story for math. And not much difference at the cutoff. If you look at reading, similar story. Not much of a discontinuity, and if there is one, it's in the wrong direction. So it looks like, at least at the intent to treat level, the invitations didn't lead to improved student outcomes. And if you look at the numerical results, indeed, for elementary grades, they're all negative, not statistically significant. Middle grades, positive, but also not significant. So putting it all together, negative results like you saw in those graphs, and no statistically significant difference. So trying to look more closely what's going on here. The big problem was lack of participation. Less than 17% of kids that were invited actually went to summer school. And that was, I will see in a moment, true across grades, some differences across student groups and participation. So here's looking across grades. You can see that the top part of the bar, the kind of gold color, are the kids that were invited and participated. And at the bottom, the blue are kids that were not invited and didn't participate. But there's a large group, the green bar, that were invited that didn't show up. And that's true at every grade level. If we look across student groups, so these are among invitees, so this is not the whole population, but among the students that were invited, we did see greater take up among students eligible for free and reduced price meals. And we saw greater take up among English learners than English proficient students. We also tried to look at impacts on achievement gaps, and this is not causal, but we looked at differences across groups and then how that difference changed over time, and did find some hopeful news here in that the gaps between free and reduced price lunch eligible students and non-eligible students diminished. Likewise, between English learners and non-English learners, and between students from low-income areas of the county to higher income areas, the gap in achievement also diminished. So potential selection problems here, but at least some hopeful news that maybe achievement gaps were closing related to summer school participation. So this is not the field of dreams. If you build it, they don't necessarily come. As I said, less than 17% of kids that were invited to the summer school program actually showed up. And that's been the case. If you look at the research pre-pandemic on summer school, getting kids to show up for summer learning programs has always been a challenge. And I think it's gotten even worse during the pandemic when kids and their parents were just tired. And we're finding similar things in other pandemic era recovery programs. So one of our partners has been using a voluntary online tutoring program. And there, the participation rate was also very low, around 18%. And there, there's a similar working paper by Carly Robinson, Susanna Loeb, and colleagues looking at a virtual tutoring program by a charter organization in California. They find similar results, that participation there was about 19%. They got some boost by informational nudges to parents, but still participation is a big problem. And one of their takeaways, and I think we would concur, is that in some ways, these programs may be exacerbating achievement gaps in that participation is relatively low by the groups you want to target. And then students that are doing okay, some of their parents are sending them to these acceleration programs. So in terms of policy, my view is that voluntary programs are not going to be effective in dealing with the sort of learning losses we've seen in other states and across the country. That trying to get kids to show up, be it after school or summer programs or voluntary tutoring, is not going to be effective, particularly for the students that need the most help. And we really need to be thinking about strategies offered during the school day. One obvious strategy is high dosage tutoring, but even that, to be effective, is going to have to be offered during the school day. And talking to our school district partners, it's hard to rearrange the school day to make that happen. But I think that's the only way that we're going to be able to really make a dent in these sort of learning losses we've been observing. That's it. Thank you.
All right, hi everyone. I'm Elise Dizon-Ross. I am a researcher at CALDER at AIR. And a lot of the things we've been hearing about are going to sound very familiar in my presentation. My name is the only one up here on the slide, but I just want to say we have a big team at CALDER that's working on this. Mike and Dan are on the project in addition to several RAs. So this is a really big team effort. All right, so before I jump into the project itself, I want to give some motivation for the project, which is probably not necessary after all we've heard over the last hour, but just sort of like to remind us and keep in our mind. This graph shows the comparison of how much students learned during the pandemic relative to a pre-pandemic cohort of students. And what you can see here pretty easily is that across the board, across all racial and ethnic groups and across all grades, everyone is seeing declines. And unfortunately, we're seeing the biggest declines among students who are already disadvantaged. So it'd be Black and Hispanic students you see have the biggest, negative bars going downward. So just a reminder that this is not just sort of a question of recovery. This is really a question of equity and whether or not we'll be able to right the ship in time to sort of, not continue on this path of undoing the progress we've made to be closing achievement gaps. So that's sort of, our motivation for doing all these projects. But the project itself is called the Road to Recovery, or the R2R project. And this is a partnership between CALDER, NWA, Harvard, specifically their Center for Education Policy Research, and a consortium of 12 school districts. So the districts we're working with represent 600,000 students across the country. So it's mid to large size districts. And we're working with districts that are quite varied in terms of their student demographics, in terms of their urbanicity. So it's a nice sort of cross-section of different district experiences. And the way the project works is that the districts are providing the research team at CALDER, NWA, and Harvard with data on student eligibility and participation in their academic COVID recovery initiatives. So this is things like tutoring and summer school, virtual learning and things like that. We're focusing on recovery initiatives that are at least partially funded by ESSER. So, that's the emergency funding that was going toward districts' ability to recover from COVID. And there's a limited time frame on that funding, right? It's supposed to be allocated by 2024 and spent down by 2026. So there's sort of like a window of opportunity that these districts have to really make use of it and try to make progress toward recovering academically. The goal of the project is to build rigorous evidence about the implementation and the effects of these efforts. And our goal is also to disseminate our findings in a timely fashion so that districts, not only our consortium of districts, but districts overall, can really learn from what we're learning in real time and try to apply the lessons that we've learned. I just want to say a quick acknowledgement. We have a bunch of funders that are enabling this project to happen. There's a lot of resources attached to it. So we're very grateful to the AIR Equity Initiative, the Carnegie Corporation, Walton Family Foundation, Kenneth C. Griffin, and an anonymous foundation. All right, so this project is ongoing, as I described, but the research team has already put out 3 working papers from it. And I just want to plug that they are all on our website, caldercenter.org/COVID recovery. So I encourage you all to check them out. The first one looked at a comprehensive picture of academic achievement across COVID-19 pandemic years. And it used, as do these all, data from the NWA math assessment, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So it's coverage sort of nationally about how students are doing. The second paper looked at the consequences of remote and hybrid instruction. And then the third most recent paper is the challenges of implementing the recovery interventions that I mentioned before. I don't have time to talk about all these papers, unfortunately, but I just want to highlight a couple key findings from the first 2, and then I'll spend the majority of the time talking about the third. So from the first paper, this is just sort of one of the key takeaways that came out of the paper. But what you have here on the x-axis is predicted growth in student achievement if students had grown the way that pre-pandemic students had. And on the y-axis, you have the actual growth of students over the course of the pandemic. This is from 2021 was sort of the end point of these. And what you can see here is the 45-degree line would basically be like, all right, students are doing just as well as they were doing before. The bulk of these districts, each dot is a district, both of them is below the 45 line. So what we know is most districts are really struggling in that aspect, but there's a significant portion that are above. So just sort of like, we want to, keep in mind always that even though there's these really, sort of concerning general trends, there's a lot of districts that are not falling under these same trends. And we want to be able to sort of learn what's different about those districts, what are they doing, and can some of those lessons apply to the districts below the 45-degree. From the second paper, looking at remote and hybrid learning, this was sort of one of the key findings. And basically what this shows is, again, looking at the growth of pandemic era students relative to pre-pandemic era, how far below was the pandemic growth. So the y-axis is standard deviations below that pre-pandemic growth. And you see that as the percentage of a remote instruction increased, the decrease grew, I should say, in terms of performance. And this relationship was even stronger the higher poverty the schools were. Now, this was, again, from 2021-22, which we know was a very hectic and confusing year. Nobody really knew what to do. So sort of the interpretation of these results should definitely not be, oh, the districts who chose to go remote were doing the wrong thing. It's just that we know that remote instruction was one of many factors that seems to be contributing to the learning loss. All right, so now I'm going to focus, like I said, on the third most recent report, which again is the challenges of implementing these COVID recovery interventions. And I'm going to go through the 4 research questions that the paper covers. So the first is, to what extent did math and reading achievement in the R2R districts rebound as of spring 2022? The second is, what types of academic interventions did these districts use and what types of students did they target? The third is, what were the initial results of these interventions? And the fourth is, how might the implementation of the interventions help explain their initial results? I'm also going to talk briefly about the next stages of the project, which we're really excited about, and specifically talk about this AAR Equity Initiative funded deep dive into Guilford schools. So I'll just go over that a little bit in the end. Okay, so the data that we have for this project, or this paper specifically, comes from multiple sources. So first of all, as I mentioned before, we have the MAP growth assessment, which is developed by NWA, and that assessment data has a couple of really big advantages. So one of the big advantages to it is that it's administered 3 times a year. So we actually get to sort of see within school year progression of achievement. The other really great thing about it is that so many kids across the country take it. I believe it's about 2.5 million students take this assessment every year. So it really gives us a chance to sort of compare our results in these districts to a national view to see how kids are doing. We also use district interviews on academic intervention plans. The districts themselves give us student level data on eligibility and participation in the interventions. And then we conducted follow-up interviews about intervention implementation. So a nice sort of mixed methods approach. Okay, so the first research question, how was the rebound looking? So basically what we have here is graphs showing for math and reading a comparison of how students did in the 2021-22 school year relative to how cohorts of students were doing before the pandemic. So, you know, sort of that horizontal line is 0 basically means if they were up there, they were learning at the same rates that kids were learning before. And we see, this is like really shockingly consistent, I think, with statistics from Michigan, is that on average, our consortium of districts, we're starting the school year in 2021, about 0.2 standard deviations where they would be below where they'd be expected to be prior to the pandemic. For math, and then for reading, it was negative 0.12. So the solid circles here is the average across our consortium of districts. The hollow circles are individual districts. And you might notice I said we have 12 consortium districts, but there was only 5 dots here. That's because we limited this analysis to districts that had sort of a good level of coverage in terms of map assessment taking, so that we are actually looking at representative data of the whole district across the terms. So that limited us to 5 districts just for this part of the analysis. And then we can see as you sort of go across the terms, how students did through winter and spring of that academic year. So a couple key things to note here. The first is that the solid line, again, the average, is relatively flat, right? So students more or less seem to be learning at comparable rates as they were learning prior to the pandemic, but they're a full level lower, right? So in some ways you can think of that as a bit of a win given how chaotic this school year was. But at the same time, they're not making the progress back that they really need to get back to those pre-pandemic levels. And that's really concerning. The other key thing to note here is that there's a ton of heterogeneity, right? So if you look at, say, the red district, it's already back to where it needs to be and better, at least sort of in math. But if you look at, say, the purple district, you know, it's kind of very troubling that their drop seems to be continuing. These general trends are consistent with when we also look at sort of the full nationwide data set of NWA MAP scores. So our consortium seems to be pretty representative of what's going on around the country. All right, so secondly, we wanted to know what kinds of interventions that districts were using and also what types of students they targeted. So there's 5 main categories of intervention that these districts were using, and they are tutoring, small group push-in and pull-out interventions, out-of-school time programs, virtual learning, and extended year. So that could be, you know, sort of tacking on a few additional days or even weeks of school, and then also, you know, summer learning programs. So a few things about these is that most districts, I don't think I did, is that most districts were implementing multiple of these. So tutoring is by far the most common, but you know, even within our sample of 12 districts, not everybody was using tutoring. The push-in and pull-out interventions were the second most common, but districts are really sort of like picking and choosing what they want to implement in their schools. The other important thing to know is that even though we sort of created these 5 categories, there's a ton of variation in these programs within each category. So even take, for example, tutoring. Is it happening virtually or in person? Is it happening during school hours if it's in person? Where is it happening? Who is teaching it? Is it for any kid that wants it? Or is it for just kids who, you know, like the teachers determine that they need extra help, or maybe standardized tests determine they need extra help? So all these different variations really influence what the program looks like on the ground. So just sort of like hearing, you know, that a school has a tutoring program actually kind of tells you very little about what exactly they're doing and sort of what the considerations are for it. Oh. The mouse? No, sure. Great, thank you. Okay, so I mentioned before that targeting was one of the ways that these programs could really vary. And there's a ton of different ways that districts are targeting students for the programs. So they are in some cases using test score thresholds, and those could be sort of, you know, standardized tests or district tests. It could be course performance, attendance, teacher recommendations often plays a really big role. And even in some cases, you know, you might have a policy or a design where they're saying, oh, this program is for students under a certain level on the standardized tests, but then teacher discretion also really influences who's actually in the program itself. Certain grade levels might be targeted, and then a lot of them are actually just fully opt-in. Especially things like the virtual learning, like they're just available, and it's really up to the student and more like their parents to how much is this program is actually being used. So what were the initial results, right? Did they actually work? So far, unfortunately, we found very little impact from last year's interventions. So here I'm showing you estimates from 10 different district intervention combinations. So for example, tutoring in District A. For some of them that have a big grade range, we've also split them out into smaller grade ranges. So that's why there's more than 10 rows on the graph. But what you see here is the red circles are impact estimates from value-added models that we ran. So basically comparing outcomes of students who did participate in a program versus those who didn't, controlling for their prior test scores, demographics, grade, school, all that. And this I'm just showing you for math for now. So what you see is basically across all these, a lot of these red dots are very close to zero, right? Their confidence interval overlaps with zero. We're seeing sort of a range, oh, maybe I even wrote it. Oh yeah, a range from negative 0.02 to positive 0.02 standard deviations. But again, these are really, really tiny, right? The green, what is that, square, diamond? What that represents is what we call the expected impact based on tutoring research. So we basically looked at research on high quality, high dosage tutoring and sort of said, all right, if these students were in a program that were as effective as that tutoring and got the average number of dosage hours that the students are in fact getting, what would we expect the impact to be? And so for the most part, those green diamonds are to the right. So, like even accounting for the fact that students are not getting that much of these programming from these interventions, they're still not sort of doing as well as we would want them to. So it's not totally doom and gloom, right? There is sort of some hints of progress, and want to keep in mind, this was 2021-22. This was most districts' first year of trying to implement and scale up these programs. It was a very chaotic year. So we are optimistic that we will see better impacts next year. But sort of these are 3 district intervention combinations where you're sort of seeing some limited positive impacts for certain grade ranges. So for example, tutoring specifically in District A for 4th and 5th graders, or District B assigned software specifically for 6th to 8th graders. So it's not that nothing's working. It's just that for the most part, things aren't really moving as a result of these programs. And it's really concerning how little progress is being made. Okay, this is going to sound a lot like Tim's presentation, but the scale intensity was often a lot lower than planned. So fewer students were being reached and the dose of support fell short pretty much across the board. So this is an example just from one district and one program, but it's pretty representative of what we found from all the other districts, where you see the total number of students in that light bar on the right, on the left in terms of thousands. And of those, 48,000 students, the district designed their intervention, their tutoring program and said, all right, 26% of these kids are going to be eligible for math tutoring. It turns out only 5% actually received it. And then in terms of ELA, they designed their program so that 22% of the kids in the district would be eligible for it. Only 6% received it. So it's really kind of shocking how much there is a disconnect between what districts are trying to do and what is happening in practice. In terms of tutoring hours, we see a really similar story. Sort of the planned tutoring hours for each student was supposed to be 67, each student receiving the tutoring was supposed to be on average 67.5 hours. In practice, these students only received 8.6 hours of math tutoring and 11 hours of ELA tutoring. So this really helps sort of explain why these impacts are so tiny. Like it doesn't give the full explanation, but given how little dosage these students are getting, it would almost seem crazy to expect that they would make huge gains. Like these are really small amounts of programming that they're being treated with. All right, so then finally, how might the implementation help explain these initial results? This comes from the interviews that we did in the districts with mostly sort of like directors of the intervention programs, but also people from central office, and I think maybe even teachers in a few cases. And there's a few themes that really emerged. So the first one was challenges reaching the targeted students, right? So one district tutoring director said, I think tutoring is happening with the wrong set of kids. And that could happen for a number of reasons, right? Like one of the things that we heard frequently was that, you know, a district designed an intervention to reach certain students, but some of those students were enrolled in other programs, or their schedule is conflicted, or it turns out they didn't have enough staff to actually, you know, instruct all the students that needed the tutoring. So there's a number of reasons this can happen, but this was a really common issue. It's not that no one's being tutored, it's just not the kids that need it most. Program staffing and staff capacity was another big one. So one district leader said, at the start of the 21-22 school year at one of our schools, they had something like 24 teachers out, all had COVID. That was 2 weeks where interventions were pulled from what they would regularly do. This was another really big thing. You know, like there's already sort of this narrative that there is teacher and staffing shortages all around the country. On top of that, think about the fact that 21-22, we already had multiple waves of COVID, right? So there were teachers missing school, even if they were employed by the district. And that really caused some chaos for a lot of the districts on top of sort of the challenges of scaling up these programs. Other sort of key buckets of information, or sorry, key buckets of challenges that we heard about were difficulties scheduling the interventions, engaging families as partners, accommodating existing policies. So like existing policies at the state level in particular, sometimes prove to be a barrier to districts being able to implement their programs, and also building central office capacity. All right, so from what we learned, we wanted to sort of give districts some general recommendations, right? And the general message is it's not too late, but time is running out, right? We don't have very much time to figure out how to make these programs work and get students to actually receive the benefits of it before the federal funding runs out and we sort of lose our chance to really invest in these programs. So sort of two main recommendations was one, improve implementation, and two, expand the intervention. So in terms of implementation, we recommended, and these are sort of seem common sense, but you know, it just sort of, the evidence really helps kind of illuminate why they're important. Establish clear targeting policies that everyone is aligned with, from the teacher to the superintendent. Creating staffing approaches that sort of accommodate the challenges that you're going to come up with of all these kids needing an instructor, and recognizing that there will be some turnover when, say, teachers get sick. I shouldn't say turnover, some churn when teachers get sick. Family and community engagement could be improved, and alignment of state and federal policy. And then in terms of expanding the interventions, we recommend that they scale the existing interventions so that more kids are getting the benefits that they can offer, and also launch new ones and think about ways to sort of effectively layer these programs so that a kid is not just enrolled in a single one, but can benefit from multiple types of interventions throughout the course of the school year. Also improve community buy-in. This is, you know, definitely kind of related to what Rick was talking about earlier. We need to translate test scores into actionable measures. A lot of the, you know, sort of parents in the community are just sort of not aware that their kid really does need to catch up and does maybe need to spend those hours after school doing the virtual learning that their teacher said that they could do, and they wonder, why should I bother? And then similarly, having more transparent communication with families to help facilitate that. Okay, so briefly, I mentioned I want to talk about the next stages of the project. And that's kind of two pieces going on there. So the first is we're going to continue this analysis, like I described, of upcoming terms over the next few years. So right now we're already starting to work on summer 2022. Is that right? Yeah, summer 2022 programs, and looking at what were the impacts of these for the districts. And it'll just kind of keep on going. And when we're done with that, we'll be looking at the following school year. And the hope is to keep being able to give district kind of real-time information on what's going on. In addition to that, we're also launching sort of a new piece, which is a deep dive into Guilford County schools, which we're super excited about. So for those of you not familiar with Guilford County schools, it's the third largest. I hope I'm getting this right. It's the third largest district in North Carolina. And it's a member of our consortium, but it's really exciting because now for this piece, we actually have Guilford as a co-PI on the project. So they're helping us to really think about what is the right design for this deep dive? What are the types of questions we should be asking? Who should we be talking to? So it's nice to sort of like have such an integrated relationship there. And in terms of this deep dive, there'll be both quantitative and qualitative work. So for the quantitative side, we're going to focus on looking at the impact of the pandemic and of academic recovery effects, but specifically on non-test score outcomes also. So we'll be looking at behavior, attendance, and student attitudes to get a more comprehensive view of how kids are doing and what the impacts of these programs are. And then for the qualitative work, we're going to be doing a deep dive exploration of the experiences of students, parents, teachers, tutors, and administrators. So really sort of, expanding how we're understanding, like the challenges of both implementing and participating in these programs. We want to understand the details of program implementation and specifically what leads to success. So we're really trying to take a look at the performance across schools so that we can understand, in schools where they really did see gains, what were they doing differently? What could be applied to schools where they're having a harder time using these programs to catch up? And that is what I just said. Yes, we'll be sampling schools based on a range of things so that we'll also demographically have kind of a wide view of what's working and what's not. So that is all for me. That's my email. Feel free to email me any questions or comments, and thank you.
Thank you. Sonya, you have a hard job.
Oh, thank you. So hello, everyone.
Hello, Sonya.
Yes, I do have a hard job because all of these papers were excellent papers. They all had really solid research questions, and I only have 10 minutes.
No, you take, we're actually ahead of time, so.
Oh, okay.
A little extra time, that's fine.
Okay, and so what I'm gonna, did you need me to do something? Oh, I don't need it. Oh, yeah. So it is a pleasure to be here with you today and to talk about these fantastic papers. How many of you are school district, work in a school district? Any school district people? So there are a few of you. Did you kind of, sort of?
State people?
Okay, well, that's good to know because I know a lot of these programs that you've heard about and a lot of the experiences from COVID, they're hitting very, very close to home. And even for me, I have a son who is a sophomore in college, which means he was a junior in 2020. And during COVID, he took calculus, and I shared this with some of our colleagues last night. He took calculus, AP calculus, AB and BC in his room remotely. And then he's previously a strong math student in his earlier years. And his senior year, he took IB higher level math. Part of it, the first semester was in his room, laying on his floor with this hoodie on. And then the second, when the district said we could go back to school, where you had the option, he was given the option. He chose to go to school as opposed to stand in his room, which was really a shock to us. And so the second semester during school, he took math, the higher level math in person. So went off to college, planning to be an engineering major, took the first year engineering calculus, and almost bombed. We spent tons of money on tutors just to get him out of the class. And he eventually changed his major. And this was his freshman year. And as we thought about it, it's a direct impact of COVID and what happened to him during that time. And so I'm still trying to explain to my husband why our son was a strong math student and very confident, is not very confident in math anymore. And I think it's a direct reflection of that. So I share that because all of these interventions that are going on in school districts are critically important. And I know you all know that about what's as it relates to what's happening to our students and our children. And so even when you think about the first paper that Rick talked to us about, the economic impact of what's going to happen to our students in the future, we have to think about, and we can't, as he said, we can't ignore or pretend that that silent killer is not creeping up. And so one thing I want to say about his paper is that it was very well written. So please, if you haven't had an opportunity to go look at the paper and read it, it's extremely well written, and one that I will be sharing back with our leadership team in Guilford County. I think it's important to note that he makes a very compelling argument in terms of asking the question, when will the learning loss stop? Like, will that ever stop? And we don't know the answer to that question. But what he does say in the paper, and you heard from all of the presenters, is that we have to accelerate learning, and we can't ignore, what's happened with our students. I also thought it was very interesting to see the comparison of the state NAEP results and that comparison to the economic costs for that's traditionally underemphasized because it's not talked about a lot. And I thought it was very alarming to know that our students are headed towards a 5.6% lower wage, earning wage than their peers. And so that to me is alarming. Again, I appreciated the extended use of the NAEP results to determine the impact on economic growth. To me, it would also be interesting to take a deeper dive into our county's labor wage information, if we could get that data from our county, to see if those same patterns exist within Guilford County, because Guilford County, oftentimes we're compared to Wake and we're compared to Charlotte Mecklenburg, but we're very different because we have a history of generational poverty. So parents are poor, their kids end up being poor, and now the grandkids are poor. And so that's not the same in Wake and in Charlotte. And so having our stakeholders in our community and our school boards understand that we are different than Wake and Charlotte from that standpoint is critically important. And so that's why this paper is important to me. Thinking about the paper that Katharine talked about and the data for Michigan, again, the analysis was very interesting, and it's similar analysis that we've done in our district as an individual district. And it is going to be analysis that we're going to have to continue to do for years to come. It's not that we stop because we think we're on the other side of the pandemic. I did have a question about it is in regards to of the districts that participated, I did wonder how many of them actually chose to offer in-person instruction. I know you said about 60% of them, but I wonder what that is in the number versus the ones who provided the shorter timeframes. And also, I think in the future it would be interesting to look across the state to see if there are any commonalities with their use in the math or the ELA curriculums, to see if that makes a difference with how students are performing across the state. Thinking about the summer school program that Tim talked about, I think, well, first, I was also impressed with the layout of the report. The report is very well written and easily to understand, and it's very timely for our district because we just had a conversation about summer school and what we're going to change with summer school, or if there's anything that's going to be changed. And so I think we do have some criteria for students who are invited to summer school. So sharing this research with our school district will be very interesting and could prove to be useful with us in terms of how we make our decisions. I also found in the paper, he talks about looking at students in less affluent regions in comparison to the affluent regions, and looking at or maybe looking at zip codes to use as a substitute for free and reduced lunch data, because in North Carolina, we can't use the free and reduced lunch data for individual students for research. And so looking at that data from those standpoints would be useful for us. And then a question that I had was for the students that attended summer school, I was wondering if you noticed any trends in the daily attendance for students and their achievement. So in other words, if students attended, say, 10 days, did you notice an increase in attendance? And then I also think it would be interesting to ask parents why, if their child was sent an invitation to participate in summer school, why didn't they participate? And the same thing for those who did come to summer school and didn't have an invitation to participate. I would want to know why that is, to see if we can glean something from that information. And of course, I'm super excited about the Road to Recovery project, since we're participating in that information, and I'm happy about the deep dive that we're doing. And I do think that a significant contribution to that research is the follow-up interviews that have already been done, and then those that we're going to continue to do. Because even in our district, it is important. Our superintendent wants to know, like, what are the people saying about how the programs are being implemented? Are they being implemented to fidelity? Are students, the right students, being asked to participate in the tutoring programs or some of the other programs that we are using? And again, just like all the other research, the evidence is revealing that for students to catch up, we have to do something different, and we have to move at a faster pace than what we're currently doing if we want to see some different results. Also, I think early on, it would have been nice to get feedback from teachers, which I don't think we did. But we are going to do it in a deeper dive to get their voices as well. And I think that is it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we have plenty of time for questions. I'd ask that you use the mic, and I think, Kyle, I'm going to give this to you to take around. While I'm bringing this mic, I'm going to just Charlie Klottfelter, who's from CALDER. I'm also going to point out that Corey Codell from CALDER is in the room, and you're going to hear from Sunny later on this afternoon. Did I miss anyone?
Thanks. These are great presentations and really disturbing. And so 2 comments and a question. One comment is that since 1980, the income distribution in this country has gotten more and more unequal. This is simply going to make things worse. So, and so it's really going to have a devastating effect that way. Second thing is that this has all been focused on the US, but as Rick would be first to say, these kind of effects have been global. So whatever we can figure out in the United States will be helpful for other countries. The question, and maybe I'm focused mostly on Rick, but during wars, schooling must have, shuts down often. I wonder if there's been research on what happens to learning loss during wars, and whether there's any, lessons about what might constitute some kind of recovery in those situations.
Well, I think the answer.
I think, yeah, green.
Oh, green. I think the answer is that we don't have good information on wars. We do have good information internationally on some lengthy school closures. My favorite is Germany, that in the 1960s, a portion of the German states had school years that began in January instead of September. And they decided that they should get on the international bandwagon and start school in September. And they did this by having short school years for a couple years. And if you follow the cohort that had these short school years in Germany, you can pick them out. There's of the income distribution, you look at the Social Security records and they pop out as being below kids before the change in the school year and below those after. And then there's some other examples of Belgium, Argentina, and Colombia that have lengthy teacher union strikes that close the schools for lengthy periods of time. And you can see that those kids never recover. Now, the problem in general is that for wars and so on, we had very little information on performance and what kids knew. And so kids got as many A's after the war as during the war as before. So, what we have now is a lot better information about the performance.
Can you get?
Hi, I'm Liz Cohen from Feature Ed at Georgetown. So one thing I'm curious about is, I guess this is maybe for Sonya, but also for everyone, is like, what are the ways, are you seeing changes in the distribution within classrooms or within schools of student achievement? And like, how are we seeing a broadening of the spectrum, and how is that making you think differently perhaps about either classroom assignments or, right? Like, do you want to put all the lowest students with one teacher because then the highest students, right? Or not? And like, and what does that look like on the ground? And then how does that sort of, what I think a lot of us suspect is sort of this widening of the achievement spectrum, even within a school, impacting the way we think about some of these other interventions and issues?
So I would say it's a work in progress. We are seeing that the spectrum is widening in terms of the achievement of students. And so it's taken some time in terms of helping our teachers understand how to work with students that they're not used to working with in terms of their achievement levels. So we have some teachers who are very comfortable teaching kids that are at the higher end of the spectrum, but now those kids who used to be high are not as high as they were. And so we're having to retrain them and provide some additional professional development to help them be able to help our students. And we're also working with principals and helping them to determine how the distribution of students are going to be in individual classrooms, and looking at our teachers and who have shown the ability to be effective with the students that are in front of them. So it is a work in progress. And even with some of our interventions, our recovery strategies that we're using, when we go into the classrooms, it's not as pretty as we would want it to be. And there are pockets of schools and teachers that need work. And it's because they're nervous. They don't want to do the wrong thing, and it's not intentional, but we have to do things differently.
Thanks. I witnessed a conversation in social media the other day about how these like attendance awards for skills for students in school are more awards to the parents, that it's more like the parents are in charge of attendance. So bringing this to, to the participation in summer programs, for example, I think that it is more about the parents. So I was encouraged by something in Tim's presentation that I don't believe that you claim causality, but you mentioned how some of these summer programs include food, and how there was a higher participation of those children that were more food insecure. So my question for whoever might have seen this is, has anyone seen surveys to parents that indicate what are their priorities when it comes to what they want for their children in terms of pandemic recovery? It might not be necessarily learning or learning paired up with something else? And have you seen the inclusion of any of those incentives that might draw parents to bring their kids because they're offering more than just learning, but whatever else might be in their priorities?
Well, a couple of things. First, getting back to a question about attendance, we've actually done some analyses looking at the proportion of the summer school that kids attended and didn't seem to matter in terms of outcomes for students. I don't have much more than anecdotal evidence about what's driving participation, but I do know, for example, one of the school districts we work with that wasn't in this study, they even provided daycare for teachers to get teachers in the summer classrooms, which was a challenge. And as you saw with this district, providing transportation, providing breakfast and lunch, and still it wasn't enough. So I think those things are important, but those incentives alone don't seem like they're going to be sufficient to get participation, particularly from the groups that need the most help.
Sonny, is this on? Yes. I want to follow up on the attendance issue, but from a slightly different perspective. I'm Helen or Sonny Ladd from CALDER. This was a terrific session and I learned a lot, and I think the data and then the programs you're looking at are terrific. My one concern about it, and it doesn't surprise me, is that the focus is throughout on learning losses, and that's learning is measured by achievement scores. I only heard one panelist, maybe I wasn't listening to the others, and that was Elise, mention some other possible behavioral outcomes that we might be interested in, like attendance of kids during the regular school year or behavioral effects. We do have data on some of that, and I'm wondering if going forward, you might look at the effects of some of these programs that are focused specifically on COVID learning losses, but their impacts on some of these other outcomes, which could be, in fact, more important in the long run.
So I can share one example of that. One of the things that we implemented in our district is an extended calendar for some of our schools, our restart schools. And which meant that those students, the students that attend that school, they go to school 8 days earlier than the students who are on the traditional calendar. When we looked at the attendance, the kids were not going to school. They started school on the first day of school that the traditional calendar started. And so we looked at the attendance, and then we recently, as recent as the survey is closing tomorrow, surveyed parents, teachers, and principals to ask their opinions about the restart school. And back to your point, parents said the restart calendar is not working for us. For a variety of reasons. We have family vacations, we have multiple kids that are on different calendars, just a lot of reasons. And so we haven't, our superintendent hasn't made a decision yet in terms of if we're going to change that restart calendar, but in a matter of 2 days, we had about 600 responses from parents, and they also provided qualitative responses back. So they feel very passionate about it.
All right, Catherine.
Oh, sorry.
No. Okay, that's a really important question. And we have some qualitative work in Michigan in a set of districts that were sort of beating the odds during the 2021 school year about how well their students did and didn't do. And all of those superintendents told us they were focused on learning, but they were mostly focused on socio-emotional outcomes for their kids. And these are districts that, you know, we wouldn't have expected to be higher performing given their demographics and their previous performance in the state. Every superintendent, every principal we talked to said, these kids need to feel safe in their classrooms. They need to be feeling they want to come. They need to be dealing with the fact that some of them have lost multiple family members over this time. And so part of my thinking on this is always, yeah, we're focusing on these achievement outcomes, but what do we know about how they're impacting other things that might affect their longer term ability to learn in the coming years?
Matt, then Steve.
So my takeaway from the panel is that everything is bad and nothing is working to fix it.
Wait, and just my little editorial, the results are like remarkably consistent across different test outcomes, different samples. It's really, when you sort of see it all at once, it's really kind of striking. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I think there is one piece of semi-good news, which is that if we look at the national NWEA data, we do see some tiny little bit of progress. Like in early grades, they tend to make up 15 to 25% of the learning loss, which is not even a glass half full, but it is something, especially in a year that was very disrupted. And so I'm wondering the panelists' thoughts on that. And I just have one other more concerning comment on that, though, which is we're all familiar with fade out in interventions, right? And we think of it as fade out of a positive effect, you know, pre-K, but also even teacher quality effects and class size reduction. And one of the weird things about fade out is oftentimes we have a positive effect, it fades out in test scores, but then it reappears later in life in a positive way. But I'm wondering if we should be concerned about reverse fade out. We have a negative intervention, the pandemic, and maybe that the effects of it will fade out on test scores in a way that we can measure in several years. But then when we might have a negative long-term effect in terms of the labor market effect that Rick is showing.
Rick?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to think about the fade out, Matt, but I do think that as I responded to Charlie, there's substantial evidence that these are permanent losses. And so, you know, we might not see them in NWEA, they might go away in the positive sense, but you can't say that Germany is not concerned about its schools and what goes on, but they didn't make up at all for these losses during the year. So, I mean, I think that the only hope, in my opinion, is to make the schools better. If we just get back, as everybody's struggling to get back to where we were, this is a generation that's going to be scarred for life, and the country is going to be hurt.
And anyone else want to comment?
Well, I think what's going to happen after the next couple of years, the cohorts that were most greatly affected won't be in the testing sample anymore. And we probably won't see massive changes in high school graduation because kids are going to get kind of passed through. But like the anecdote of your son, I think it's going to hit at college where kids maybe get to college, but don't really have the skills that they normally would have had and have a tough time getting through post-secondary. And then it's going to show up in the labor market. So I'm unfortunately somewhat pessimistic about the long run impacts if we don't do something soon.
Oh, hi, Steve Rifkin, University of Illinois, Chicago, University of Texas at Dallas, and Calder, to put them all in since it's being recorded. I was struck by the divergence in findings between English and math. And I also had a high school son during this time. And I think one of the things that happens when you can't be in school is kids can't take tests, or the tests become group work or open book. And maybe that doesn't hurt English so much, but it could really hurt math. And, you know, and behaviorally, it seems like on the one hand, there's a lot more caring for the kids because of this happened. And a lot of, you know, kids had to endure a lot of things. But I see at the university a real lowering of expectations for kids, real lowering of absences. And that's not even being captured by this. So I'm wondering if we think about schools that are most likely to maintain expectations, and I'm thinking of like no excuses charter schools. What do we observe about achievement losses and, you know, and what has happened to those kids as compared to other kids? Because it's not surprising to me that a tutoring program, apart from taking exams or really being supportive of kids, where kids have the effort to work, may not be that successful. And just spending money on these programs, as we know, isn't likely to be that successful either.
But we do know that charter schools pivoted much more rapidly than traditional public schools at the time of closures in March. That within a couple weeks, charter schools had programs in the field, whereas traditional public schools did not. Now, I'm not sure that we know yet how that impacted the performance of kids, but we do know that they were at least trying harder in some sense than the traditional public schools.
We have charter schools in our sample as well. So we have all the traditional publics and the charters, and we did do the breakdown analysis. We can't look at no excuses versus not. It's conflated with the fact that charter schools in Michigan are much more likely to have high proportions of African-American students and low-income students and be located in urban areas, which are districts that were more likely to be, and they actually were more likely to be remote for more of the school year in Michigan as a result. We don't see substantial differences once you control for those factors between charter performance and non-charter.
Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah Reber from Brookings. So my question is about the extent to which the COVID recovery is or isn't different from business as usual, and also the usefulness of framing and thinking about it and addressing it that way. So I guess in like summer 2020, friends would ask me like, how are the schools going to deal with this? Everyone's going to come back and be like in all different places. And, first I was like, oh, they could do summative assessment, blah, blah, blah. And it was like, in some sense, kind of always true that like kids are in different places. If you look at the disparities that were shown and, for example, by race or by income, like the widening, I don't know, in some sense is not that huge relative to what was there before. It's bad, but so it's sort of like the same, in some sense it's the same problem. Like some kids are behind, other kids are less behind. I think what does seem really different to me is that this socio-emotional piece or whatever you want to, like the kids, I had a kid who did adolescence in the basement. I think, there's like a socialization to school, some of the stuff that Steve's talking about. So that does seem to me kind of like there was a big shock to that. But and this isn't just a comment, it really is a question because I go back and forth. And I guess, yeah, and then because sort of it seems like now we have an intervention solution to the specific problem of COVID recovery, which takes focus away from like things like core instruction and sort of the core educational program. And if it's kind of like we just need to be better at school, I think is what Rick is saying. How useful is it to, you have the ESSER money that needs to have this focus, but aside from that, like should we be just like thinking about making schools better separate from COVID?
Can I just quickly answer one thing about that, which is what I tell people all the time in Michigan is if we knew how to just make schools better, we would have just made it a long time ago.
Yeah.
So I think when we say like, we just need to make schools better, which I've been, I can say I've said, like, we need to be overcompensating and doing more. Like, we don't have good ways of doing that, especially in a situation where, teachers are exhausted. A lot of them, we just found new evidence in Washington. It looks like that we do see a spike in exits recently, but for a long time it was looking like we didn't see this mass exodus, but that doesn't mean there wasn't burnout and an unwillingness to sort of do more on top of already having done so much more. And kids the same way. You asked about why kids didn't go to summer school. A lot of parents told me like, my kid has been through so much. The last thing they need is to be in the classroom all summer. Like they need to be going to the lake and they need to be running around with their friends and riding their bikes. So I do think that there's something to be said about like, we might have too high expectations given our body of knowledge to date.
I'll just add one thing is, one of the stories that we heard from districts that we talked to was, as they were struggling to figure out how to implement their interventions, if it's during the school day, it means they're taking the kid out of something. And there are a lot of instances where kids were getting, some sort of tutoring, but they were missing the core instruction. And so, then you have to wonder like, how much value is that really adding? Is this like the right, and it's hard. You don't want to take them out of art or recess or make them stay longer. Like there's no real easy answer, but it does sort of feel like it's not just an additive thing. It's a trade-off to some extent. And I think that, I don't have any nice way to tie this in a bow, but I do think it's something that's really hard for districts to figure out how to balance those.
Well, I think one thing is different is just the scale and magnitude of the issue. So yeah, there's always been kids that are struggling. There's been Saturday school programs and after school, but the number of students that have fallen considerably behind is just way bigger than normal. And I read it, and schools are struggling with a whole bunch of issues. I mean, one of our districts, the first semester kids were back in person, had over 100 weapons violations, running from brass knuckles to an assault rifle. And so they were spending money on, metal detectors and clear backpacks and what have you. But on top of all that, there are all these kids that are really far behind that I think are going to have long run negative consequences.
Rick.
Well, I just make a quick remark. I think we're going to talk about some of these things next session also, but the way I look at the discussions that Tim and Katharine and Elise gave of what's going on in the schools, it's how much can we improve things without changing the schools? How can we do exactly what we were doing before, but do it a little bit more of exactly what we were doing before? And I agree with Katharine that we've sort of squeezed out all of the gains that we can think of on a large scale of getting how much can we do exactly what we were doing before? And the question is, do we want to, coming out of COVID, trying to do something slightly different than what we were doing before? And none of the discussions of what's going on in these school districts suggests that we're willing yet to do with that.
I'm going to take the liberty of making two comments. One, I think $200 billion also makes this different than just sort of regular time, that there's schools have a lot more resources than they would typically have with a limited runway. And then the other comment is actually related to Steve, your observation about the difference between the math and ELA results, which this is not to disagree with what you said, except to note that kids typically, the gains they see in math are larger than the gains in reading. So when you translate the loss in math and reading into like how many months or weeks look like they're lost, they don't look as stark as they do when you're looking at it in standard deviation units. And I'm not quite sure what is the right way to sort of think about that issue. Claire.
It's a nice segue. So I'm Claire Abbott. I'm from the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And in Massachusetts, we saw very similar patterns in ELA and math losses, and then the quote unquote rebound from 21 to 22, well, not at the level of sophistication you all have done in Michigan and elsewhere, but the rebound was much more pronounced with math than in ELA. And in fact, we're seeing really concerning continued declines in ELA, particularly in our lower grades and particularly with historic lows in writing. So we're focused right now on early grades literacy for that reason in particular, but I'm curious, and maybe Rick, you can speak to this or anyone else, in terms of targeting interventions for long-term effects, how do you think about grade level targeting? What should we be looking at in early grades versus secondary grades when we think about the long-term effects of the COVID?
I don't think I have an answer to the targeting question. There's arguments both ways on my own anecdotal view is that people who are going into kindergarten in 2021 and freshmen in college were the ones hurt most because they had to learn how to do something very different than they had ever done in their life. But past that, I'm not quite sure that I understand whether it's better to build up early grades or late grades, whatever.
So also, I don't have a great answer to this other than we're also studying the third grade early literacy law in Michigan, and we are seeing massive differences pre and post pandemic in the proportion of kids who are scoring what they call at least a year behind grade level, which is really 2 standard deviations below. And so there's kids who are in that K-3 and then that third grade range. And, it's not true that you read to learn and then you learn to read and you read to learn, but it is true that at third grade, there's an important part where you have to kind of really understand some of the fundamentals of literacy to be able to continue developing. And so what we're seeing, I think, is actually fourth, fifth, sixth graders who didn't learn the fundamentals of literacy. And we're seeing the early kids who didn't have preschools or anything like that, and they're coming in at a lower level. So I actually think, and then you got the middle school kids who are dealing with all the middle school kids deal with going into high school. So I think that there's no, like, my understanding from Michigan is that everyone needs to be targeted in different ways. And we don't have, to Rick's point, current professional development isn't set up for that, right? And so there does need to be a really strong rethinking of how in schools of ed, we're working with our teachers continuously, with our pre-service teachers, and how districts are working to continuously develop their teachers in ways that it's not really fair to ask of them. They weren't expert in this before, and quickly ramp them up.
Yeah, and one thing we've found in the Atlanta area that if you break down the so-called learning loss by grade level, elementary students during the pandemic were much greater impacted than middle school students. So now they're in sort of late elementary, middle school. And if I was to target by grade level, those are the grade levels I target.
Is it working? Okay. Keisha Ose-Sarfo, I'm with the Council of Great City Schools. I appreciate the presentations today and the data that's been presented. But I do think that we should be careful around the language we use around recovery efforts across our schools and districts, and suggesting that some schools tried harder than others, language like that. A lot of our districts really struggled in that transition, and we really should spend some time contextualizing what happened when we transitioned to online instruction, and as we recover the shift to online instruction, addressing the technology needs of our districts, going to one-to-one devices, Wi-Fi, and so on. Knowing that our Black and Brown communities were hit hardest when it came to COVID, and the impact of COVID in those communities, increased community crime during COVID, loss of wages, and so on. So I just want to make sure I say that as a statement, but also appreciate, of course, the conversation, and wonder if there's research, and maybe it will be talked about later on today, but at least with the current panel, that you all are looking at in terms of what's working. Our districts are really looking for solutions, as well as understanding the data. So not just contextualizing what happened, but also working on what really is working and the heroic stories that have come out of the pandemic, because I think there are a lot of them within our districts that should be also highlighted.
I'll just say that I didn't really talk about this, but one of the sort of aspects of the R2R project is that, like, the consortium is not just the 12 districts who are willing to work with us, but it's also kind of a network. So we're planning to have, gatherings where districts can learn from each other, and also, like you say, sort of celebrate the wins. Like, it's really hard, and some districts are managing to make a program work, and like, that's amazing. And so sort of facilitating the ability to sort of raise up those stories and have them learn from each other is, I think, one of the nice benefits of that kind of program.
Just in our qualitative work with districts that we're doing sort of exceptionally well compared to what we would have expected prior to the pandemic, during that first pandemic school year, they talked about really doing on the backs of their teachers and administrators. And so they kind of said, we had these great relationships with our teachers and trust beforehand. We had really good communication networks within our districts and our parents beforehand. We were able to kind of build on all that in 2021, but there was expressed, and we're following a number of them again through, but there's expressed concern that they cannot keep that up, right? There's only, people are human, and they at some point need to sleep. So I think that was one really important thing of these districts. It wasn't they weren't trying any harder. They might have had capacities that other districts didn't have ahead of time. What we did hear about, the one intervention everyone talked about, was strong differentiation, which again is on the backs of teachers and administrators, right? But saying, I know exactly where student A is versus student B versus student C, and I'm going to sort of do some sort of competency-based work with these kids to make sure that they are learning at their level and trajectory that they need to go. That's very difficult to do as a
There's a little bit of a question of how you measure what's working. The most stunning part of the presentations, I thought, was Elise's chart of how schools were implementing things relative to what you would expect if they did it absolutely as best as you could. But if they did absolutely as best as you could, you closed only a portion of the learning loss. That this was not going to work in terms of closing the learning loss. So you could say, well, some school districts actually got up to expectations, but the expectations of what they were trying to do were completely insufficient. So I think we have to keep that on the table, that, that it's not just, can you get up to what the best research says is possible?
And
Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to add in terms of wins, when we looked at our state achievement data, we did see that for math for us, we were rebounding at a faster rate than the state overall, and also at a faster rate than the other two larger districts in the state. So that's a win for us. Of course, we're not where we want to be, but that is something that we celebrated. Additionally, we have implemented to the conversations around mental health, e-therapy, counseling for our students and our staff, and they are taking advantage of that at very high rates. And so, because that is a concern of our students, and that's something that we're celebrating as well and plan to continue.
Hi, Rob Olson from GW. I want to build on Rick's comment and ask Elise a question about the comparison between the very small effects of tutoring that you found, even smaller than the effects that were found in the literature and I was hoping you'd elaborate on that a little bit more, and also sort of speculate on why is it that with all the money that Dan pointed out in implementing these tutoring programs, that in general, the effects of these tutoring programs have been less than even expected by the literature? Is it sort of less faithful implementation of the program? Is it the scale problem of trying to implement programs effectively at scale? Is it students not showing up? Do you have any data to sort of speculate about that?
Elise, can I answer it quickly? Because I want to save room for one more question if someone wants, but there's going to be a little bit of bleeding over into the next session too. Yes. I think it's all of that. I want to be a little bit more precise about what that expectation was, the difference. That was the learning gains that would be expected if the number of hours that we saw kids getting the interventions that we saw had the effect that was found pre-pandemic from high dosage tutoring, 0.26 or 0.36, I can't remember what it is, or 0.38 adjusted to a per hour basis. So the differential might be thought of as all of the things that were challenges in this past school year that would make the effects smaller than when you see relatively small scale interventions of high dosage tutoring, when there's not tight labor markets and teachers out with COVID and kids out with COVID and trying to implement things at scale. One more question, all right. Save it then. Last question for now.
Hi, I'm Alec McGillis with ProPublica. I was just curious about extended school years. If you could talk a little more about that. I know it was mentioned as one of the 5 buckets that you gave, but then it wasn't in the list of actual interventions by your districts. And I was just curious, are school districts not really doing it much, or are we just seeing kind of what was described in Guilford with students, who were offered that not actually participating, or what's the thinking on that possible tool?
So we didn't include, it wasn't in sort of the diagram with the impacts, mainly because the districts that we focused on for that analysis were ones that had really good data on a variety of interventions, and it just didn't happen to have, sort of the extended year as one of them. But it does seem to really, really vary. So, like there are, structured summer learning programs, but then in terms of what extended school year could mean, was kind of all over the place. So for example, you have Guilford, where you said 8 days prior to the start of the school year. There is also an extended year program that was, I think, like 20 days. And then there was one that was like 3 days, which makes you wonder why, you know, like it's so expensive to make that happen. So I think that probably more than any of the other kind of categories of interventions was the one that, I mean, it's not surprising, it's new, you know, like that's kind of comes out of the blue, that the idea that like, I'll just have another week of school, you know? So I think that it seemed like the districts were really struggling to figure out how to make that work and get the right people to show up and be able to cover the costs. And I think that we definitely need more time to see how those will start looking more, because they seemed very sort of, you know, just, they were figuring it out on the fly kind of.
Again, Tim has the data on this, that it wasn't quite working, right?
That's
Well,
different. That's
here's the
summer school versus extended. I'm thinking more about actual, everyone's coming to school longer, basically.
There's not a ton of that is going on. I mean, if you, one of the best known extensions was in LA, right? Where it was 4 days, I think, was added. And it was very controversial. There are some districts that are doing some kinds of extension, intercession, but even those extensions, there's a voluntary element to it. So I haven't seen a lot of, we're extending the school year for a long period of time and students, you all have to come. And teachers, you all have to come. Yeah, yeah.
But nobody showed up in LA to the extended days.
Right.
And
That's the intercession I'm thinking of. Yeah, yeah. Okay, please join me in thanking the first panel. And we're gonna roll right into the next panel.